thylakoid compartment. This is where the oxygen gas generated by photosynthesis comes from.
All right, so in this video, we're going to be going over the light reaction. So let's just take a quick second and kind of revisit what the last video was all about. And there are a few things that you at least want to be familiarized with. So really, we're going to be just looking at this left side. So this whole thing is a chloroplast. Remember, plants have many chloroplasts. And let's kind of get this dialed in terms of what's happening here. So light is basically going to be the initial energy source for all of this. Remember, light is carrying energy in photons. Okay. Now, each one of these little things is called a thylakoid. So common questions is what or where does the light reaction take place? It takes place in the thylakoid. A stack of these is called a granum, but most of the time they just want you to know that light reaction takes place in the thylakoid. Okay. Now let's just kind of take a second and remind us of the equation. So water plus CO2 is going to make O2 plus glucose, C6H12O6. Okay. We should balance this out. So 6, 6, and 6. Okay. Now, the reason why I wanted to point that one out is because in this step, we're going to be looking at what's going on here. Okay. Water is basically going to be split. And again, water actually is going to essentially lose its electrons. So water is actually going to be oxidized. So basically, it is going to be oxidized. So the whole point is we're going to basically want to lose these electrons from water. Okay, so that's something that is specific. And like I mentioned in the respiration video, you always want to follow your electrons. Okay, know where they're coming from and know where they're going. So to get this one started, I'm going to just play this little clip from Mastering Bio. So before we do that, let me just kind of make sure you guys have an understanding of where you're at. So we're basically going to zoom in and look at what's happening on the inside of one of these thylakoids. So before I go over this, this is looking at an inside view of one of those thylakoids. So let's take a look here and see what's going on, because this is kind of a nice little overview. Now, before we do that, this should look somewhat similar to cell respiration because it works pretty similarly, minus a couple of key things here. But basically, we got one of the most ridiculous things in biology. We have the two photosystems. Photosystem 2 occurs first before photosystem 1. A little backstory is just because photosystem 2 was discovered after photosystem 1. They just thought there was one photosystem. So anyway, let's get this dialed in. These little green things right here are pigments. So basically, like I mentioned in the previous video, these pigments are specific to how much light and what type of light they can absorb. So if you understand that the more light that these pigments can absorb, the more easily it's actually able to pull electrons off of water. So we have two photosystems. These other proteins are going to be involved in the electron transport chain. So again, it's going to be shuffling electrons. Keep track of where your electrons go. And then we get another protein down here. This looks familiar because you've talked about it before, which is ATP synthase. So let's just let this play out and see what's going on here. Now I have some protons on the outside. It's showing you here again that these are your chlorophyll.
Absorbs light.
So these are going to help absorb light.
The absorbed energy.
And as light gets absorbed, these things essentially get enough energy to pull off electrons from water. Okay. So this is showing these little red dots are representative of electrons. So electrons are going to end up on what's called NADP, making NADPH, very similar to NAD in cell respiration, carrying electrons. So watch what happens here. We get these electrons. It's showing the electron transport chain. Protons are getting pulled inside the thylakoid. So the pH inside a thylakoid is relatively low because there's a lot of protons. The electrons get excited again in photosystem 1. And in terms of that, photosystem 2 is going to replenish those electrons by essentially split the water. So if you follow through that, water actually split. The electrons got excited, and this is the O2 that we breathe. So this oxygen is actually going to leave. Now, that's where the oxygen comes from in terms of the byproduct of photosynthesis. So kind of a lot's going on here. So let's kind of let's review what's the point of really what are you making here. So the hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid, right? So this is all your thylakoid, the thylakoid lumen. These protons are going to diffuse down through ATP synthase, just like in cell respiration. As long as it's turning, you're going to be making ATP. So you're doing that chemiosmosis. So in the light reaction, really a couple of things you want to care about is ATP and NADPH are produced. You also make oxygen, and that leaves as a byproduct. That's what you're going to help breathe in. So let's kind of take this one a little bit slower here, and we'll kind of get this dialed in. So I like to talk about it from this side. In terms of what's happening, we'll kind of take it slow. So again, we have two photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 happens first, okay? The big thing and the most common test question is that water actually is going to be donating the electrons, okay? So water is actually the electron donor. So these little yellow ones are representing the electrons. And basically what happens is that these little chlorophylls and pigments absorb so much energy that they can actually pull the electrons off of water. And these electrons get really, really excited. And then the electrons shuffle from one protein to the next, to the next, to the next. And then they get excited again in photosystem 1, okay? The electrons get super excited again, and then they're gonna be shuffled from one protein to the next. They end up on NADP. NADP works exactly the same as NAD in cell respiration. Easy way to remember it is NADP is only in photosynthesis, so remember P for photosynthesis. So NADP is actually going to get reduced. Reduced means gaining electrons to NADPH, okay? And basically you want to think that this is basically carrying energy, if you want to think of it from that standpoint. Because it's going to be used to power the Calvin cycle. So just keep track of the electrons, okay? The water donates the electrons, right? And the electrons end on NADP plus, making NADPH, okay? That's the final place where the electrons are going to reside, all right? Now, again, common test questions would be, well, what if your photosystems are damaged? Well, you're not able to split water. You can't get those electrons. So you're not doing any photosynthesis if those NADPHs aren't actually produced. So just be aware of that's kind of the thought process that you might have to be able to put together. So that's great. Now there's protons on the exterior, very similar to respiration that get pulled in. And again, you get a high concentration of protons inside the thylakoid lumen, right? So all of these protons get built up just to diffuse back down through ATP synthase. So as long as this ATP synthase is spinning, doing chemiosmosis, it's grabbing a phosphate and an ADP, putting them together, you make ATP, okay? So, and that's gonna go and power the Calvin cycle. Don't fixate so much on how much ATP is produced for one molecule of water. You really just have to know, okay, water is used in a light reaction. Like I was mentioning earlier, keep track of where your oxygen goes. So the oxygen from water actually is the oxygen that actually leaves the plant, and that's the oxygen that we breathe in. So keep track of that particular oxygen. So that's kind of a nice overview of the light reaction. You want to know that those really, hopefully this makes sense now, what's actually going on in one of those little thylakoids. Water comes in, light is absorbed through those little pigments in those photosystems. The oxygen is what is basically leaving the cell, and then you make ATP and NADPH. So other questions would be, well, where did the electrons from NADPH come from? Well, they came from water. How is ATP produced here? Chemiosmosis. So understanding that. So basically this is just a nice little overview of really the two photosystems. So basically light energy helps excite those electrons, and then they lose a little bit of energy as they're going from one protein to the next. Then they get really excited in another photosystem, and then they end up on NADP, making NADPH, okay? Now this just shows you differences in the pigments or the differences in photosystems. So like I mentioned earlier, the more light it can absorb, the better off the plant is going to be, okay? And so what this is telling you here is the pigments on this photosystem are slightly different than the pigments in this photosystem. The reason why, and these are showing you this particular photosystem can absorb about the 680 wavelength, okay? The more variety of light it can absorb, the better off the plant's going to be, because it's actually able to harness that energy easier. So let's kind of show you another quick little visual on photosynthesis here. So I'm going to do this little bio film right here. So we'll do the light reaction real quick. And hopefully it's pretty simple. So we'll basically zoom this out. So this is showing you thylakoids, right? So if you didn't catch that, you can see some water going in, right? So there's kind of a lot going on here, but let's break it down. It's actually not too bad. It should be pretty easy now that we've kind of gone over it. So here's your two photosystems that's showing you that light is getting absorbed, right? These are your electron transport chains. Now, that's something that is important to at least be able to catch. So check it out down here. I have water that's donating the electrons. Water donates the electrons. They get pulled off as these electrons get excited. They get shuffled from one protein to the next. So just another way of seeing this whole thing in motion, because there is a lot going on. So like I just mentioned a second ago, water donates those electrons. It gets split, and then it's going to form oxygen, O2. Okay, so those O2 essentially leave. That's the oxygen you breathe. We're going to follow the electrons first, it looks like. So the electrons get shuffled from one protein to the next. So this is basically talking about these proteins in the electron transport chain. The electrons get excited. The electrons end up on NADP, making NADPH. Okay, that's your electron carrier here. So this is going to go and power the Calvin cycle. Now check it out. I have all these protons down here, so they're diffusing and going down their gradient, and it's making ATP synthase spin, and you do get that high production of ATP. So chemiosmosis is happening here. Don't let this freak you out. This is still going down its gradient. I'm going from a high concentration to low, right? I have more protons on the inside than I do on the outside. So that is basically the whole chemiosmosis and really the light reaction. So just remember the big three things that get produced in the light reaction, and make sure you can feel pretty confident on them. Light reaction, you make ATP, NADPH, and oxygen as a byproduct. Okay, so feel familiar with those, the kind of the ins and outs, and we will see in the next video talking about the Calvin cycle.